In this episode, I talk with my friend Dan Grossman. I met Dan through the Monastic Academy community, where he trained for about a year from 2017 to 2018. Dan's had a really interesting practice background and then also has done a lot of really interesting research in the field of meditation and trauma and psychedelics and intersection of those things, and is going to be starting a PhD program soon to continue doing that kind of research. So I wanted to ask Dan about his own history with practice, as well as the kind of research that he's been doing and hopes to do in the future. I had a lot of fun chatting with him in this conversation, and I hope you'll enjoy listening to it as well. Hey, Dan, thanks for joining me today.
Lovely to be here.
I've been really enjoying catching up with you recently and our conversations about a lot of topics, and just really wonderful to have you on to have a chance to chat about these things together.
Yeah, likewise.
So I think maybe to start, we could just talk about your own background with meditation practice as kind of a like basis for the whole conversation. How you got into meditation, what your history with it is, and everything like that.
Sure. So my freshman year of college, I made a friend who had recently spent a summer at this place called the American Yoga Foundation, which I guess we can talk about later on.
Mm-hmm.
And he had been going there since he was like 7 years old, and so he sort of had like the Buddhist stuff kind of baked into his being from the start. So we became friends like on the first day of college, and there was kind of an exchange that grew over the course of that year. And I kind of just like, it sort of just rubbed off on me, and some of the texts I'd been reading started to kind of seep in, and I started dabbling around with my own meditation practice and some of the body work and yoga that he showed me as well. And then the following summer, I didn't really have anything planned, and the opportunity came up to do a 6-week internship at the American Yoga Foundation. And that was really like my first, I guess you could say, like deep dive into, or immersion into mindfulness and body work and body awareness. And it was awesome. It was like one of the best summers of my life. And I came away from that feeling tremendously spacious. And I think I even might have grown like a ½ inch or something because my spine decompressed. And so I needed really no more convincing that there was some value in this work. And it sort of developed a lot over the course of college. And, you know, on and off, but there was always this kind of thread of like of a mindfulness practice through my experiences in college. And, you know, I struggled with a lot of depression and anxiety, particularly in the middle 2 years. And it was sort of just this like touchstone throughout all of it. And so it sort of was always percolating, and it came a point, you know, which we can get into later on, where I sort of came to a crossroads in my life, and I had always had this idea of like, what is it like to really dive in for like a long time and do like intensive meditation training? And so that's when I ended up moving into the monastery from 2017 to 2018. So that's a little of a background. I can say more if you'd like.
Yeah, definitely. I'd be curious to start just by talking about the American Yoga Foundation, because I've heard a little bit about it from you several times in the past, but you know, other than you, I hadn't been exposed to it, and it seems like there's a really interesting set of practices there, and like a sort of different tradition. So could you tell me a little bit about that organization and, you know, the different techniques and practices there?
Sure. So they're pretty off the beaten path. And you have like kind of more like, you know, organizations that sort of exist a little more in the mainstream or in the limelight, like Omega and Kripalu and sort of these other like traditions. They are not like that at all. Like they are really like a mushroom that prefers to just grow in the dark, you know? So it's a really small community that was founded by this woman, Monica Hathaway. I think 1969 was the year that they were incorporated. And it's in the Catskill Mountains of New York. And just a little history, Monica was like a pretty accomplished ballerina, had danced on Broadway, had her own dance troupe. At some point when she was relatively young, she contracted polio and was paralyzed on one of her legs. And through her work with physical therapists and yoga teachers and the like, she managed to cure herself of the paralysis. And somewhere in there, and it's kind of a big mystery, I don't really know why, but she started getting into Tibetan Buddhism, and particularly in the lineage of Chogyam Trungpa, also some other relatively unknown or lesser known teachers such as Gurdjieff, who I don't know too much about, but he's a pretty popular one at the foundation. So she started getting into all of that stuff, started developing her own form of yoga, and in the process attracted a group she was living in New York City at the time, and attracted a group of people that basically helped her build this place in the Catskill Mountains and further develop their practices. And practices are really simple. I mean, it's kind of a synthesis of different kinds of yoga and breath work and mindfulness. But basically around the process of releasing inhibitions from the body that might result from trauma or environmental conditioning, or basically false ideas about the self, etc. And so it's sort of a process of turning, it sort of makes mindfulness practice into a full body contemplation when you can start feeling subtler patterns of tension and start working through releasing them.
So yeah, I've had the privilege of seeing you do these practices before in person, but can you just describe kind of your own daily routine of doing these practices and what they look like for someone who's not familiar?
Sure. So there's really only a few things that they teach that are, I mean, it varies, but the main stuff, like 80% of it, is basic stuff. One of the things is called basic stance, where you learn to basically stand with the chest open, breath is full, knees are unlocked, and the weight is going through the outside of the heels. And the idea is that you want to learn how to stand in a way that's aligned with gravity, so that you're not creating friction with between your weight and the earth. And so that's one thing they do, and I practice that daily, usually 5 to 10 minutes a day. And that definitely brings up a lot of tension in the body. Less as I've done it. At first it was really hard, but now it's much easier to do it. And then some simple practices like opening and closing the arms, opening and closing the legs. They teach a method of walking where you're dropping your hip as you walk, because often when we walk unconsciously, we're pulling our hip, and we're not walking in a way that actually releases the weight into the ground. We're pulling our weight. And so there's a lot of subtle practices they do meant to just like release unnecessary tension in how we carry ourselves. And so that's kind of the stuff I do every day, usually like 30, 40 minutes or so of the practice, and then like 20 minutes of sitting meditation, basic, just following the breath and labeling thoughts.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think the emphasis there on using the body and doing body work is really kind of unusual for, meditation practice and certainly for your own
Presently,
exposure. Yeah. Can you say like why you see that approach as valuable, since it's such an unusual one?
Sure. So I think like my sense is, in the West, we don't really pay, and I'm not really sure if this is that common in traditional Buddhist culture, but certainly in the West, we don't pay very much attention to the idea of preparation before meditating. And I think often, and I've seen this in the monastery when I was during my time in the monastery within myself, and also within some of the other residents, that you start a serious meditation routine and very quickly find yourself bogged down with all kinds of tension and discomfort and unresolved trauma and emotional distress. And so it becomes very difficult just to do the simple instruction of following the breath, because there's so much already that our body has learned and developed in response to all of that distress, and the ways that we kind of subtly like distract ourselves from it. And so when the body is calm and that tension and stuff has been worked through, it's so much easier just to sit and follow the breath and just do basic mindfulness practice. So my sense is, from a meditator's perspective, having like some basic grasp of working with tension in the body and working with these kind of stuck places in the body, and they're really felt in the body, is invaluable. And you know, and I've told you before, and it's kind of a view I have, that I think almost everybody who seeks to get on a serious path of meditation would do better to either take on a bodywork practice first, or at least have a more expansive practice vocabulary that includes some of that stuff along with sitting meditation.
What would you recommend for such a person if they were totally brand new and they wanted to take your advice and do some body work stuff?
Yeah, there's any number of things. I mean, the work that I do, like, anyone's welcome to come and do a stay at the American Yoga Foundation. You can post a link to their website,
Hmm.
and so that could work out. There's also qigong practices. There's some various trauma work like somatic experiencing, tai chi, yoga practices, etc. But I think the basic point is like becoming more familiar with patterns of tension in the body and just embodiment in general. And it's like one of the first things I heard Soryu say when I moved into the monastery was that meditation is something you do with your body. And somehow that has completely been missed in how we think of it in the West,
Hmm.
that it's a mental exercise or an intellectual exercise. But in my experience, the rubber meets the road in like working with felt sensation and how it interacts with the mind. Yeah.
I'm getting the sense from the way that you talk about it that it's, even though the particular practices that you did that you do from that you learned from the American Yoga Foundation are really valuable, that you're not like stuck on them. It's not that they're better. It's just to get involved in the body, to relax, to increase that body awareness, and that there's a bunch of ways to do that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, this has worked for me. I do think it has a depth about it that I think is somewhat uncommon. And partly, I think that's partly just built in because the forms that they do are meant to be repeated like for like a long time. You're not going through like, you know, like a kind of typical sort of yoga routine where you're rapidly changing from one posture to the other. You're really filling into subtle patterns of tension in the body, and in daily life becoming more aware of how different things affect you on like a body mind level. Like when someone says something and anger comes up, really getting familiar with what the signature of anger is and what kind of thoughts pop into mind and what sensations come. So the consideration is more internal. You're not like, how do I deal with this person that's making me angry? You're like, how do I like look at this anger and be with it and hold space for it? So yeah, it's worked in my experience, but there's any number of other practices that, you know, many roads up the same mountain. So
Hmm. Wonderful. Yeah. So tell me. I think it's pretty interesting. Just as a side note, like the year that you were at the monastic academy was the year that I wasn't. You know, I was
yeah,
gone for
we
about,
overlapped a little while.
overlapped a little bit.
Yeah,
Um, yeah. So
you were also there the first day I was there.
that's right. Yeah. I think I was visiting because
Yeah,
yeah. Um, but anyway, tell me about your time there, and you know, in particular, like how you would say you grew while you were there, and what you took out of that year of training.
sure. Yeah, so it was there's a broad spectrum of experience that happens there. And I think anybody would agree that living in the monastery is basically just like amplifying human experience times whatever, times
Totally.
so it was challenging. And I think
Uh-huh.
through that, there was a lot of growth that happened. In terms of like my meditation practice, like more familiarity with like what meditation practice is in the context of like a long-term retreat and what it's capable of, having more of an understanding of what it means to have space with thought and to be able to just like see thoughts as being out there rather than like up in here. Another thing would be um, understanding a little more like the power of mindfulness as far as dismantling like sort of congealed thoughts and emotions. And you know, I had this one experience on one of our retreats, for example, where I'd be sitting and just out of nowhere I would start feeling bad for myself. Like nothing would prompt it. I would just be sitting there and suddenly there would just be self-pity. And so I was working with a technique of labeling, which was just like see, hear, and feel. And so just like labeling when I would see a mental image, when I would hear a thought, and when I would feel some kind of emotional content. So anytime this pattern came up, I would just start tracking it with that. And over the course of the week, it just like expanded. And it's like, you know, they often use the analogy of like a film reel, where it's like you start to kind of see the frames in the experience and the space between them. And the whole pattern, when it was viewed like that, just totally, it had nothing to stand on, you know, it fell apart. It was no longer this like big like rock. It was like a bunch of grains of sand, you know? And so, you know, that was a very direct experience of what mindfulness is capable of, and what it's like when these patterns really kind of disentangle. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of like, there's a ton of things I could say in response to that, because the growth happened on many levels, and in many ways it's still happening. You know? So yeah, that would be one answer to that.
Yeah. Would you say that there are any significant changes that happened for you on they talk about the responsibility side of like your capacity to act in the world?
How so? You mean in terms of the decisions I make and so forth?
Just you know, at least from the outside, it looked to me like, you know, it was really nice to hear about your experience growing through meditation, and that's inspiring. But, you know, I also saw from the outside just a lot of growth in you in terms of, you know, how you're showing up at the organization and the things that you've gone on to do since then. And just would be
Oh,
curious to hear about your own experience of that.
yeah. I would say that like I was kind of always on this trajectory, and the monastery was kind of a chapter in that.
Hmm.
Um, but I will say, like, it was kind of a booster pack, like that having had that experience in the monastery opened up like a whole bunch of doors. And like, as much as like the purpose of the monastery isn't like really to like just give you credentials as like, oh, look at, I did this big long retreat, you know,
Hmm.
etc. Like, I do think like it opened like professional possibilities and networking opportunities that otherwise might not have ever been there.
Hmm.
And so like, I really think it was kind of a gateway to a lot of what I've been up to right now, which we can talk about as well.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, just as well from, you know, you were talking about the role that the American Yoga Foundation has played for you, and, you know, that you started off being like an intern or an apprentice there, and then now you're on their board and you're
Yeah, yeah,
capable of serving this nonprofit that you really care about. And,
yeah.
uh, you know, that's inspiring to me to know about. So,
To be fair,
um,
it's a pretty low maintenance organization. Like, they really don't have too much of a program other than their Sunday classes. But
mhm,
that's also partly because like they're in kind of a big transition right now. Monica Hathaway, the founder, died in '96, and like they're pretty old. Like, they're all
mhm,
in their like 70s and 80s at this point. So
mhm.
it's quiet. It's quiet. But you know, 10, 20 years, it'll pick up steam again, I'm sure.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, so let's talk about the research side of things. Just how did you get involved in doing like psychological and clinical research to begin with?
Sure. So I guess it started like my freshman year of high school. My first science project in high school was like this study looking at differences in fear responses between boys and girls in my school. And I showed them like this kind of shock video. It's like this ghost car that's on like the camera, and it disappears, and like a really scary zombie like just pops up on the screen and screams. So I was looking at heart rate changes and comparing them between the boys and girls in my class.
Hmm.
And Interestingly, that became kind of like a thread. And so like, I mean, the way I kind of think about it is like, I didn't know it at the time, but it's sort of like it was like a budding interest in like visceral, like embodied psychology. And so that carried me to college, where I started in the neuroscience major. I guess first of all, I should say that like my mom's a psychiatrist, her mom was a psychoanalyst, my sister's a psychologist. So it kind of runs in the family in a way. Um, so, um, so I got to college and took to the neuroscience major, and then my senior year, you know, and I started getting into the mindfulness and stuff, and would kind of compare notes between what I've been reading in Buddhism and what I was learning in my classes. And then my senior year of college, I did a senior thesis, which was like looking at the startle response, a mindfulness intervention, like a mindfulness-based stress reduction intervention, and looking at possible changes in the startle response. So I started the course at my school, like I recruited participants, designed the study, et cetera. It was a massive project for a senior thesis, but it was really good experience. And there wasn't really any changes. There were some problems with the study design. But like after that, I was like pretty hard leaning towards, you know, psych research and mindfulness and this sort of work. So that's kind of that. I definitely had like some career crises along the way where I was having a very hard time finding much of anyone doing work that I really was interested in, like genuinely that I felt compelled to do. And so I was like, then why am I doing a career if I don't have like a template for what is possible in this career, or one that appeals to me? And I remember going in 2016 to the Mind and Life Institute conference, ISCS 2016 in San Diego with two friends of mine, being really excited because there were all these like, you know, academics that I had wanted to meet that I'd been reading about in all these papers and stuff. And then I get there and I'm just totally uninterested in like everything that's happening at this conference. And so like I had during the conference this like kind of existential crisis where I was just like, why am I doing this if even the mindfulness stuff like doesn't appeal to me? And that in a way kind of led me to the monastery because I was in a job that was in psych research and that too wasn't really compelling me to stick around. Am I still here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah, sorry, you froze up. So I ended up leaving that job and joining the monastery and kind of just like entering into this big question mark about my life and what I was doing with it. And I can't say the monastery particularly answered that question, but when I left, things just started happening. Like I started getting involved in the psychedelic research community here. I got hired onto a pretty interesting project at the VA. And that kind of concern hasn't really come up anymore since then. Sorry, this is a little more of a personal tangent than I initially
No, it's great.
intended for. But yeah, so that's kind of, you know, an answer to your question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the VA project you were alluding to, that's the Tai Chi project, right?
Yes.
Sorry, I'll restart my video here.
Oh yeah, I just lost you.
I can still hear you, but my video is, there we go.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so tell me about the Tai Chi study.
Sure. Yeah, so I work as a head research tech at the Behavioral Science Division at the National Center for PTSD here in Boston. And we are doing a large clinical trial that's looking at a Tai Chi intervention for veterans that have something called Gulf War illness, which I didn't really know about before I started the job, but apparently it affects about a third of the veterans that went into the Gulf in the 90-91 conflict. And it's pretty terrible. It's a multi-symptom illness, probably coming from chemical exposure in the Gulf, burning oil wells, immunizations that went wrong, sarin gas floating around in the air, etc. Big disaster. And it's been a really long time and there are no good treatments for these guys. And they're in a lot of pain. And so the idea of the study is to give them a little more of a behavioral way of working with their pain rather than resorting to stuff like painkillers and alcohol for managing it. So that's kind of the arc of the study. I've been there for just over 2 years now, helping out with it. And now it is all online because of COVID. So that was a whole process of transitioning all of this to the internet.
I believe it. So the study's still happening?
It is still ongoing, yeah.
Gotcha. So you probably don't have any results from it yet.
We don't have results. Anecdotally, it's mixed. I think for one, it kind of depends on the degree of investment that the veteran has in maintaining a daily practice. Some of them, I would say, across the course of the intervention, at best, we have people reporting generally moderate improvement in their symptoms, and usually only some of them. So my advisor doesn't think we're going to have, like, particularly on our quantitative measures, we're going to have an especially big effect if we even do have one, because we're also comparing it to a wellness intervention that's like kind of health education and some basic mindfulness training and stuff like that. So whether Tai Chi really works here, it's hard to say, partly because the data hasn't been published yet, and also partly because there's so much variance in people's bodies and what they really need. So, it'd be nice if there was something a little more powerful for these guys, but, it's what we got for now. That's at least what the VA's got for now. So.
Sure, sure. Yeah. And can you tell me about the studies that you're doing with MDMA?
Yes. So just point of clarification, I'm not actually running any of the studies or coordinating them. I'm more involved kind of as support staff on the periphery of that. But yeah, so I work as a night attendant on the Boston site for the MAPS MDMA assisted psychotherapy study for PTSD. And so now I kind of have two different jobs, like in the trauma world, and that's kind of a big interest of mine these days. And so that is a large multi-site phase 3 clinical trial that's basically looking at 3 administrations of MDMA in conjunction with psychotherapy for people that have a history of severe treatment-resistant PTSD. And so my role on that is basically to just spend the night with them after they have their experiences and just kind of tend to them and make sure everything's okay until the morning. So that's my role. What I'm really doing is like talking to these guys pretty in depth, getting to know them. I'm not doing therapy on them, but they're always very eager to share their experiences. And it has been remarkable. And I'm sure anyone who's listening, who's seen any of the study agrees that there's like a tremendous amount of promise in this line of work. And it's been a huge privilege to be able to see it firsthand and to see the kind of transformations that unfold for people. I mean, you can see it in their face. Like, I remember walking in after one guy had his final session and just taking one look at him and just being like, holy shit. It was unbelievable. It looked like he lost like 5 to 10 years off of his face just because all the pain and stuff that he was holding just like melted. And they're finding at like 1 year follow-up, at least in the phase 2 of the study, that there is even greater remission for PTSD at that point than there is immediately following the treatment. So my kind of sense of this is that it sort of kickstarts a process and opens a window of plasticity for people that can then like set them in a direction of processing the trauma in other ways or in daily life. And sometimes you just don't see the effect like immediately. But over time they find like, I'm like just not as stressed out about that as I was. So that's a little about that. And that's been really amazing experience. I haven't been there in a while because I don't know, they're kind of between the first and second part of phase 3, but hopefully soon.
Gotcha. That's really exciting. Huh.
Yeah.
And you're hoping to do more research on this kind of thing in the future, is that right?
Yes. So I will be starting in the fall at University of Alabama, Birmingham, in the lab of Peter Hendricks, who does some studies of psilocybin-assisted therapy for cocaine addiction and has one starting for fibromyalgia in the fall. He also does, generally, he's an addiction researcher and has published on psychedelics with the Hopkins crew as well. And so we do have a lot of common ground in that. And so I see the psychedelic field as being maybe the most promising thing in psychology right now. And so I'm really eager to get involved. This has been an interest of mine for a long time, except, when I started formulating it, I thought it would be like at least 10, 15 years before I'd ever start to get involved. And then like the MAPS job came through much sooner than I ever anticipated to be doing something like that. And so it's all really exciting. Yeah, there's just a lot happening in that world right now.
Yeah. I'd be curious to hear you describe what some of the like open questions are that you have that you're hoping to research or might be interested in investigating more.
Sure. I actually keep a list of this. So let me pull up some off the top. So a few sort of like general ones, kind of starter questions would be, so they're not all research questions. They're also kind of like practicalities and just more like philosophical stuff about like what impact is this going to have on our society once it mainstreams. So one of them is like, what advantages combining different drugs have in a therapeutic sense? For example, commonly MDMA is combined with other tryptamines like LSD or psilocybin. And so is that better than psilocybin alone? When is it better than psilocybin alone? When isn't it? Et cetera. Also, another question would be about how we credential psychedelic therapists. That's kind of a big one because in my opinion, and I think I share this opinion with many other people in this field, I don't think anyone who hasn't had experience with psychedelics or some commensurate amount of introspection is qualified to be able to hold space for anyone who's on a psychedelic. And I also don't think that whatever governing body does the credentialing process for psychedelic therapists, I don't think they're ever going to be able to mandate that someone does a psychedelic before doing this. So, and additionally, how much is enough? And I think that's another question, which is you're probably going to have a ton of therapists who take one dose of psilocybin and are just like, my life has changed, go into a whole savior complex kind of thing. And then, like think that they're qualified to start giving this to other people. And I can guarantee you that's going to be a situation that's going to happen going forward. It's going to be inundated with people that really haven't had enough experience to be able to respect the depth of these experiences for people, and also to have worked through their own stuff enough to be able to not project it onto others in that state. So that's another question. One thing I'm really curious about is over the last couple of years, I got really interested in interoception and body awareness, which I think outside of psychedelics, maybe one of the coolest fields of research ever. I think how body awareness works hierarchically in the brain is one of the coolest things I've ever read about. And so I'm really curious about how psychedelics affect people's body awareness and how they relate with their emotions, like on a moment-to-moment basis. And my sense is when you process trauma, particularly with MDMA, I've been hearing from the people in the study and from others I've known who've gone through this, that it kind of makes your emotional experience more raw. Like there's less concept and narrative and kind of stuff just being piled on top of what's basically just an experience of energy. So that's something that's really interesting. And to me, it kind of suggests that there's something happening in the interoceptive circuit that's changing in terms of how people experience their bodies and their emotions and what they do with that information as well. I could go on and on. I mean, I don't have all the questions like immediately loaded up in here, but anybody who's familiar with this research probably knows that it's wide open right now. I mean, the possibilities for drug development are wide open. The kinds of things that we might be able to treat, chronic pain. I wonder about some of the conditions that are typically contraindicated, like bipolar and schizophrenia, and how long and how, like, if they'll ever be able to benefit, because it would be a shame if that is entirely just walled off from this very promising treatment avenue. But at the same time, it has like a history of being like, so-and-so had this experience and then it triggered a psychotic episode and, et cetera. Yeah, there are just so many possible research questions.
Definitely. I mean, I know one that I'm really interested in as well as how it relates to contemplative practice of,
Totally, yeah.
I could see a story where it's really helpful for contemplative practice, where it allows people to make shifts. I could see a story where it turns out to be like kind of unrelated and just sort of a red herring.
Yeah.
I don't know what your sense of that is, and it's probably just too early to say, but I'm curious about that angle as well.
Yeah, same. I actually have, I run an interest group. I co-lead an interest group that's devoted to exploring that intersection of contemplative practice and psychedelics. And that's really, I mean, it's sort of a group contemplation. Like, I don't think anybody in that group has like a firm answer that it's just like, yes, it definitely helps with meditation, or no, it definitely does not. It's sort of like we're all kind of just feeling this out and we're like, we don't really know. Like, I think it's very common that psychedelic experience is a gateway for people to get into a meditation practice. And in that sense, like, I have no doubt that it's helpful. But whether like continued use is helpful, when it is, when it isn't, I think it depends a lot on what you put into it, and where you're coming from. And, I find it hard to imagine it being a hindrance per se. Um, but that's kind of just my own take on, like, I think if you have a challenging experience on a psychedelic or something, like, it just becomes more grist for the mill. It's experience, and in meditation, all experience is just experience. you know so, like, it's a little hard for me to imagine that it could really, like, slow someone's progress in meditation per se. But I don't have, like, strong opinions about any of this because, like you, I'm a student. I don't really know. you know so
Yeah.
one thing I will say is, back to the point about people beginning in meditation and then sort of discovering all this kind of tension and stuff that's kind of been accumulated in the body. I have a pretty strong sense that psychedelics are really useful for working through that stuff, and that a lot of the healing happens in real time. So it's not just that you have, like, kind of a glimpse. I mean, you do kind of just have a glimpse and then the window sort of closes, but it's also what I see with these people in the MDMA study is that in the sessions, they're having, like, releases and processing the trauma and shifts in how they relate to it. And that endures. And it also kind of opens up a pathway whereby that kind of gets nurtured, that new perspective gets nurtured going forward. So I think psychedelics are really useful for processing that stuff. Beyond that, chasing enlightenment and transcendence and stuff like that, I mean, I don't really know.
Yeah, sure.
So
Sure. Yeah, it's funny because you told me a couple of times leading up to this interview, like, you're not an expert, and I was like, I don't think there are experts on the things that you and I are interested in. Like, sure, there are people that have more academic experience, but, like, especially this question, right, of, like, meditation and psychedelics and trauma, of, like, how those three things relate. It's like, I don't know, maybe there's really good research out there that's like, enlightenment is this is what happens in the brain, this is definitively what trauma is, and how every psychedelic interacts with that. And it,
right.
but I haven't seen anything
Definitely
like that
not.
yet.
I don't think we'll ever really formulate that kind of, like, a certainty around it. I think it's always going to be, like, to some extent, an individual sort of thing, and people have different takes on it. Some Buddhist teachers are hardline that, like, psychedelics will not help you in your meditation practice. In fact, my mentor at the American Yoga Foundation, the other day, I was like, "Do you think psychedelics can be useful for Dharma practice?" And he kind of just laughed and he said, "No."
Yeah, right.
And I tried to kind of walk him back from that and just to, like, be, like, a little more, just like, it's a little more of a nuanced topic than just no,
Yeah.
and I still kind of feel that way, but I also see where he's coming from. I don't know if you've heard that story about Ram Dass giving LSD to his teacher in India.
I have, but please share that.
Yeah, so he gave, I'm probably going to butcher it in the process, but it was like he gave him, like, 300, like, micrograms or something of orange sunshine, which was LSD that was sold, like, over the counter in the 60s or something.
I
And
didn't know
so
that was
he
a
was
thing.
like,
Wow.
yeah. So he was like, so he gives it to him and he takes it and he's like, "Give me another." So he gives him another and he takes it. And, Ram Dass is like, "This is going to be interesting." And he's like, "Give me another." So he gives him another. So the guy takes, like, 900 micrograms or something of LSD. I don't know if the numbers are right here, but anyway, so, he's following him around the whole day and following around his teacher looking for something to happen. And the guy's just having his ordinary conversations with people, and then I don't really remember how the story ends exactly, and I think it's told in a bunch of different ways. But the one I remember is that, like, at the end, Ram Dass asked him, like, "What happened? Like, how was your, like, LSD experience?" He was just like, "Give me a little headache." I think the idea, sort of just the lesson kind of just being, is that he's already there. He doesn't need, like, the LSD is not going to give him something because he's already kind of, like, summited that hill, so to speak. And so, like, I think in that sense, like, once you're at that point, why bother? Like, it's not going to do anything for you that you haven't already done. But yeah, it's an open question for all of us, I think.
Sure. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to share or mention while we're still on the conversation?
Nothing was particularly jumping out right now. One thing I would say is, if any of your listeners are interested in joining the Psychedelic and Meditation Affinity group, shoot me an email. We can paste it in the comments or
Great.
however this works.
Yeah. We'll put in the show notes.
Sure. And yeah, I'm happy to add you to the group. We meet every other month for like a discussion facilitated by a different person every time.
And that's online now in the days of COVID.
Online, you can be anywhere in the country or in the world as long as you can make our 10 a.m. Eastern time meetings on Saturdays usually.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah,
Great. Well, it's kind of you to invite folks to that, and I'm sure there'll be some people that are interested. So
yeah, it'd be great.
Well, thank you so much for chatting about this stuff with me. It's really interesting and inspiring to hear about your story and the work that you've done, and I'll be following closely the research you do in the future. So consider me a fan, and it's been a wonderful conversation. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Tosh, and I enjoyed it as well.